Wearing the necklace her husband had given her, the woman asked her mother-in-law to take a photo. Just as she was driving along the highway, a convoy with flashing lights stopped her. "I have a surprise for you," her husband announced solemnly, digging into his backpack. Daniela froze in place. She hadn't heard such words from David in years. It seemed like all their surprises had stayed back in the days when they were young, in love, and just beginning their relationship. After that, both had gotten bogged down in routine and completely stopped surprising each other. "Here you go," he smiled, handing her a necklace. Daniela widened her eyes in surprise. She was holding an incredibly beautiful piece of jewelry that shimmered when the light from the lamp fell on it. "How beautiful," was all Daniela could manage to say as she inspected every detail. She was so impressed that she didn't even notice the lack of a gift box or tag, which usually come with expensive jewelry. "I was just walking around the city and happened to stumble into a jewelry store," David explained, "and when I saw this necklace, I immediately knew it would look great on you, so I couldn't resist and bought it." Daniela couldn't contain her happy smile. She had been waiting for her husband's return from a long business trip. She hadn't expected a gift, especially something so magnificent. She felt guilty for meeting him with a simple dinner of cutlets and mashed potatoes. A necklace like that deserved a festive dinner, which she had already planned to treat him to the next time. "Thank you," Daniela said joyfully, hugging her husband around the neck. The best gift. Her mother-in-law, who was visiting them at the time, even clapped her hands. Since she and Daniela were on good terms, Dolores often came over when David was away on business, so Daniela wouldn't feel lonely. "Good job, son," she said approvingly. "You really made your wife happy. Keep it up." "Exactly," Daniela agreed, smiling sincerely. Together with Dolores, they started admiring the necklace. The elderly woman praised her son's gift, and Daniela agreed with her. "Trust me, no one else has this," her mother-in-law remarked, helping her fasten the necklace around her neck. "I'm sure all your friends will be jealous." At these words, Daniela just smiled. She didn't have many friends, but she did have a few colleagues, mostly women. She could already imagine how everyone would be surprised when she showed up at work wearing such a luxurious necklace. Daniela worked in a kindergarten, where she frequently interacted with other teachers and caretakers. "Oh, could you take a photo of me wearing it?" Daniela asked once her husband had gone to have dinner. "I want to keep it as a memory." Her mother-in-law, lamenting that she didn't understand much about technology, squinted for a while but eventually managed to take a few good shots. Daniela gazed at the photos, admiring them. Not only was she wearing an amazing necklace, but her face also displayed an incredibly happy smile that made the picture even more attractive. "I can't believe that's me," Daniela said in awe, staring at her smartphone screen. The photo was so beautiful that she couldn't resist posting it on social media as her avatar. Daniela rarely shared personal photos, but this one was too perfect to keep hidden. Suddenly, she wanted the whole world to see her. Afterward, several old acquaintances, whom she hadn't kept in touch with, messaged her. They complimented the necklace and remarked how much Daniela had improved. For the entire evening, she couldn't part with the gift. The necklace was so stunning that Daniela kept touching it or simply admiring it. One could understand her. After all, her husband rarely gave her gifts. Usually, they were for special occasions like her birthday or Christmas, and they weren't as extravagant as this. This time, not only had he surprised her for no particular reason, but he had also given her something so grand. "Are you sure you haven't done anything wrong?" Daniela suddenly wondered when they were about to go to bed. David only smiled at her suspicion. "Absolutely. I mean, can't I just make you happy for no reason?" He winked. "You can," Daniela said contentedly, laying the necklace beside her. "Are you planning to sleep with it on?" Her husband laughed, looking at the scene. Daniela shook her head, reluctantly putting the necklace away in the bedside table. When she fell asleep, David went to the kitchen, quietly closing the door behind him. At that moment, his phone rang, fortunately set to silent so it wouldn't wake his wife, who had very keen hearing. The screen displayed the contact Ernest. However, as soon as he answered the call, a soft female voice spoke. "Did she like it?" Evelina asked briefly. "Of course." David chuckled. "I haven't seen her this happy in ages. She couldn't put that trinket down all evening." "You see, I told you it would work," the woman replied. "Now she'll let you do anything you ask. She won't even get upset if you stay late at work or go away for a few days with your friends. Believe me, women know how to be grateful." David and Evelina had been seeing each other for a few months. They had met at a pawn shop that she managed. David had gone there on a friend's request, but he left with a beautiful woman who agreed to have coffee with him. They had been drinking coffee together for several weeks before their relationship grew more intimate. It was easy for them to keep their affair a secret since David often went on business trips and he had no trouble masking their dates as work. Daniela, of course, wasn't thrilled about her husband's long absences, and recently she had often voiced her displeasure. So, Evelina suggested that David give her a necklace, one that had just come into their pawn shop. "Are you sure you won't have any problems with this?" David had asked before. "This trinket looks too fancy." "Don't worry," Evelina had smirked. "I've got everything under control," she said confidently, even though the jewelry was indeed worth an astronomical sum and was custom-made. The pawn shop she ran had a bad reputation. Local criminals often hung around, and stolen goods from various sources would end up there. But usually, such items didn't stay long, as they were immediately handed over to illegal jewelers, who melted them down and created new pieces to sell. The police often showed interest in such a shady place, but it had good protection. And the law enforcement officers had no substantial evidence. That's why the pawn shop continued to thrive. They spoke a little longer, after which David, fearing he might be exposed by his wife, hung up and returned to the sleeping and unsuspecting Daniela. The next day, Daniela fought the urge to wear the necklace to work. However, she reasoned that it would look strange with a sweater and jeans, so she abandoned the idea. When she was about to leave, an unpleasant surprise awaited her. The car stubbornly refused to start. "Come on, sweetheart," Daniela pleaded. "Now is not the time to show your character." Despite the car being old, Daniela loved it dearly. It wasn't just a means of transportation for her, but also a gift from her father, who had saved up for a long time to surprise her when she graduated from university. So Daniela treasured her car, although it gave her plenty of trouble, especially during the winter months. After a while, the car decided to start. Daniela breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed she would make it to work after all. However, her conclusions were premature. As soon as she turned onto the right street, she was stopped by police officers. In fact, they had been following her for some time, but Daniela preferred to think they were after someone else. "Please step out of the vehicle," the officer said. And Daniela had no choice but to comply. She immediately felt a nervous tremor, even though she hadn't been speeding and was wearing her seatbelt, so there was essentially no reason to accuse her of anything. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "Daniela Crossman," the officer asked, clarifying. She nodded, noticing that they knew her name even before she showed any documents. "Is this you in the picture?" He continued the questioning, showing her the exact photo Daniela had posted online. The more time passed, the more puzzled she became, so she slowly nodded. "A couple of days ago, this necklace was stolen from businessman Mr. Davidson's collection," the police officer explained. "How do you explain that it's now in your possession?" Daniela's eyes widened in shock. She never could have imagined that she would be holding a stolen item. "It's good that I left it at home," she thought to herself. "My husband gave it to me," she said, only now realizing that the necklace was without packaging. "And where did he buy it?" The officer continued his questioning. "I don't know, it was a surprise," Daniela replied, flustered. "David went on a business trip to another city and stopped by a jewelry store there." "Can he confirm this?" The lawman squinted. "Of course," Daniela answered quickly. "I'll call him now, and he'll confirm everything," she said, but her hands were shaking so much that her phone fell. No matter how hard she tried to call, the robotic voice kept repeating the same message. The subscriber is temporarily unavailable. Come on, Daniela said in panic, staring at the screen. Until the situation is clarified, you'll need to come with us, the officer declared coldly. You can try calling from the station. At those words, Daniela truly felt scared. She understood that she was innocent, but the situation was such that it made her feel like a real criminal. Listen, how can you even be sure this is real jewelry? Daniela suddenly perked up. My husband has a modest income, so he probably just bought me a good fake. A simple and logical thought occurred to her, but only now. The officer remained unyielding, and she was still detained. Daniela didn't even have time to call work and warn them about her absence. I really need to, she said from the police car. I work with children. I need to inform the management so they can find a replacement. The police called for her. Naturally, this news didn't cheer her colleagues, who had already noticed Daniela's absence and started urgently searching for a replacement. Are you sure Daniela can even be trusted with children? One of the caregivers asked, doubting her in light of recent events. I don't think decent people are suddenly taken by the police like that. This woman didn't particularly like Daniela. She was envious that the children adored Daniela and always tried to paint her in a bad light in front of the management. This time, she didn't even have to try too hard. The situation spoke for itself. The director fully agreed with her. He didn't want to get involved in the matter. The call from the police was enough for him to draw conclusions. The man was too concerned about the reputation of his kindergarten and didn't want any trouble with furious parents who would definitely not be happy to know that one of the caretakers was somehow involved with the police. A couple of minutes later, Daniela was dismissed retroactively. While at the police station, Daniela still couldn't reach her husband. His phone was simply turned off. Then she called his office and found out that David had gone on an urgent business trip for several days. What is going on? Daniela exclaimed in frustration, the walls of the station starting to seriously weigh on her. Just moments ago, she had witnessed the police handcuffing some poor guy and taking him away to a cell. The sight made her feel uneasy. She repeated the story about the necklace from the beginning to the end several times, but they still didn't want to let her go. So Daniela contacted her mother-in-law and asked her to come. When Dolores confirmed her words, they finally released her. However, she had to sign a statement saying that she wouldn't leave the city and promised to come back for further questioning. Daniela Crossman, I'll be honest with you, the police officer said, at this point, you're the only suspect, so I strongly recommend you prepare for everything and get a good lawyer. Daniela nodded nervously. The word suspect sent a tremor through her body. I can't believe this, she thought. It was even scary to imagine how much a good lawyer would cost right now. That's why she decided to postpone it, as they didn't have the funds at the moment. After all, I'm not guilty. Why would I need a lawyer? She continued to think. Her thoughts were interrupted by her worried mother-in-law's voice. Let's just hope David doesn't get into trouble because of this, the elderly woman said, concerned about her son. The thing was, like Daniela, the police couldn't reach David, so they had asked through his relatives to have him come to the station and give a statement as well. Daniela knew that when David started talking, it was very possible that he would become the main suspect instead of her. And that thought terrified her. Daniela didn't respond to her mother-in-law's words. She understood the worry, typical of any mother. However, she had too many questions for her husband, with the main one being where he had gotten that cursed necklace, which had already brought them so many problems. After dropping her mother-in-law off at home, Daniela rushed to work. It was already lunchtime, meaning she had missed half of her shift. Mr. Davis, please forgive me, she whispered when she saw the director. Something strange happened to me, you won't believe it, she wanted to continue, but her boss interrupted her rudely. Daniela, you're fired, he said flatly. I don't need employees who get picked up by the police. But Mr. Davis, this is a terrible misunderstanding. Daniela immediately protested. Please, let me explain everything, and you'll see I'm not guilty. I don't want to hear it, he cut her off, then slammed the door of his office right in front of her. No matter how much Daniela tried to justify herself, no one wanted to listen. She had no choice but to accept her fate and leave. Daniela sighed heavily, holding back tears. She loved her job so much because she adored children. She had no children of her own, so she gladly gave all her unspent love to the little ones in her care. The injustice made her feel incredibly sad. She entered the park near the kindergarten, where many mothers were walking with their children, which only deepened her despair. Daniela knew she would be a great mother. She would love to spend time with her own little ones. She was ready to dedicate herself fully to raising a child, but that opportunity was not there. Her marriage to David had lasted 8 years, and during that time, they had not become parents. Daniela had gone to a clinic about this issue, but they could only shrug their shoulders, not understanding where the problem lay. All the tests she took showed nothing, yet her husband stubbornly refused to get checked. "I'm not going to trust those charlatans." "Don't even ask," David would say firmly. "I know them. Now they'll say I've got some terrible illness and need a lot of money for treatment. And you, fool, will believe them and go to the bank for a loan. I'm not going to the hospital. They're all scammers." No matter how much Daniela tried to convince him, David refused to meet her halfway. "You want to mess with nonsense? Go ahead," he'd reply. "I know I'm perfectly healthy, so my feet won't set foot in any hospital." She didn't understand why her husband was so hostile toward clinics, but there was nothing she could do about it. These conversations came up every year. David was sure everything was fine, they just needed to keep trying, but time went on, and they remained childless. Yet David didn't seem to care. Whenever Daniela brought up adoption, he would immediately start a scandal. "Daniela, are you out of your mind?" he would get angry. "An adopted child? What if their parents were alcoholics or worse? Have you thought about that?" "No, I don't want that kind of happiness." In this matter, her mother-in-law fully supported her son. So Daniela was in the minority. To compensate for the absence of children, Daniela threw herself into her work. But now, she had been stripped of that opportunity. Just think about it. And all because of this damn necklace, she thought, sitting alone. To distract herself a little, she decided to check her social media. As soon as she logged in, another blow awaited her. It turned out that an incredible number of people had seen the photo with the necklace overnight. There were hundreds of comments under the post, most of them negative. Everyone eagerly accused Daniela of theft, as the missing necklace had become a high-profile case, even making it onto the local news and into the newspapers. "Oh my God," Daniela said, covering her mouth with her hand. One comment was worse than the other. It became so hurtful that tears began to run down her cheeks. She had only wanted to share a beautiful picture, and now complete strangers were writing such cruel words, as if she were the enemy of the people and had done something truly terrible. God, and I bet the parents of my students have seen this. Daniela thought through her tears. She desperately wanted to smash the cursed phone to stop seeing all the nastiness, but that wouldn't solve the problem. While one woman felt deeply unhappy, the other simply smirked with malicious satisfaction. Meanwhile, Evelina was scrolling through social media, enjoying the humiliation and bullying of her rival, to which she herself had contributed. The plan worked, the young woman said bitterly to herself, alone. The truth was, Evelina had deliberately set everything up. First, to get rid of the suspicious necklace from the pawn shop, and second, to rid her lover of his annoying wife. David had been somewhat indecisive, and so Evelina took matters into her own hands, drastically. She knew full well that the police would eventually come for the necklace, so she happily passed all the problems onto Daniela. Evelina knew who was behind the theft of the jewelry, but preferred to remain silent, as it also served her interests. Recently, her shop had received a new batch of goods, including a couple of interesting items, naturally stolen. Evelina eagerly rubbed her hands together. She loved her work. "I don't know what to do next," Daniela said desperately, as David hadn't answered her calls for a long time. Dolores, who had witnessed her daughter-in-law's emotional torment, merely pursed her lips in silence. She understood that, even if indirectly, her son was guilty in this situation. If he hadn't brought that necklace into the house, everything would be fine, and Daniela wouldn't be suffering. "Delete everything," said her mother-in-law, "at least let this filth stop pouring in." Daniela nodded. It couldn't continue like this. She deleted her profile to stop seeing the horrors unfolding under her innocent photo. Daniela suffered for several days, then reluctantly began looking for a new job. They lived in a small town where rumors spread at an incredible pace. As a result, she quickly gained a reputation as a thief. Some employers didn't even want to let her step into their offices, while most simply turned her away, deeming her unreliable. Daniela decided to lower her expectations significantly and tried applying for work as a janitor or cleaner, but even then, she was shown the door. Social media had incredible power, and in her case, it was destructive. At some point, she ran out of steam. Daniela was tired of hearing constant rejections and negativity. She sat down on a bench and covered her face with her hands. It was incredibly painful, but she was too exhausted to cry. She desperately wanted the bad luck to end. Suddenly, a luxury foreign car stopped next to her. Daniela, who had some knowledge of cars, perked up, noticing the expensive vehicle. First, a young driver got out and opened the door for his boss, an elderly man in a classic suit. She couldn't help but smirk slightly as she looked around. These two looked completely out of place in their poor neighborhood. "Are you Daniela Crossman?" the man asked unexpectedly, addressing her directly. Daniela didn't respond, just nodded with wide eyes. It felt strange that such a person would choose to speak to her. "My name is Frank," the stranger introduced himself. "I'm the owner of the necklace." At that moment, she froze. No, she could not bear any more personal insults. "Listen, I've already explained everything to the police," Daniela started, panicked. "I didn't steal anything. My husband gave me the necklace. I have no idea where he got it from." "I see," the businessman replied calmly. "Can you show it to me?" His calm demeanor and peaceful intentions threw Daniela off. She had expected him to come and make a scene, but apparently he had entirely different plans. "Yes, of course," Daniela murmured, and then brought out the necklace. As soon as Frank saw the necklace, a serene smile appeared on his face. He gently ran his fingers over the stones. "It was worn by my late wife for many years," he explained. "She wore it when I proposed to her, and she never took it off until the very last day of her life." Daniela sighed heavily. It was such a touching story. She felt bad that, though indirectly, she had been involved in the fact that this man nearly lost the memory of his beloved. She expressed her condolences. "I see you're telling the truth," the elderly businessman continued calmly. "I won't accuse you of something you didn't do." After these words, Daniela finally began to calm down. She thanked Mr. Davidson for his trust, and then told him about all the trouble she had faced because of the necklace. "Take it," Daniela said. "It's still yours." The elderly man carefully placed the necklace into the pocket of his jacket, but didn't leave immediately. "Of course, it's not the same," he said thoughtfully, "but I'm currently looking for a maid. And if that kind of work suits you, I'd be happy to offer you a position." Daniela agreed without hesitation. She wasn't in a position to choose from many options. Since the position of maid at his house also included accommodation, the businessman gave her a little time to gather her things. Daniela wanted to wait for her husband's return, but his phone still remained unreachable. She decided to go ahead and deal with things as they came. "Daniela, maybe you shouldn't?" Dolores asked doubtfully. "It's a different house. I don't think David will like it. And do I have any other option?" Daniela shrugged. "If I don't work, we'll be living on the street. As for your son," she took a deep breath to avoid saying too much, "I'm not too fond of him either. But I put up with it. So he'll have to get used to our new life," she said, and with those words, she left. When Daniela started working, Mr. Davidson was not at home. At first, it seemed to her that the mansion was empty. But later in the evening, a young woman appeared from one of the rooms. Everything about her suggested that she had just come from a wild party the night before and was now trying to recover. This was Gabriella, Frank's daughter. He also had a son, Gerald, the same age as the girl. They were twins. "Who are you?" Gabriella frowned. "I haven't seen you here before." "I'm the maid. Your dad hired me recently," Daniela explained. "Ah, the help," Gabriella said with a condescending smile. "Then start cleaning my room." At first, Daniela was taken aback by this treatment, but she composed herself and went to do her task. The state of Gabriella's room shocked her. There were bottles of high-end alcohol scattered all over the place. Someone must have had a lot of fun recently, she thought, picking up the bottles and putting them in a trash bag. "Sis, you got anything for a headache?" a male voice called from the room. "Ah, a maid?" Gerald said with the same dismissive tone. "Come to my room later." "Breathe, Daniela, just breathe," she kept repeating to herself before continuing her duties. The Davidson children were typical representatives of the golden youth. Thanks to their father, they had plenty of money and didn't need to work much to get more. They could afford anything, so they mostly spent their time at parties of various intensities. Sometimes, they got into such trouble that their father had to step in to solve a multitude of problems afterward. As it turned out, Frank had gone to another city for business for 2 days, so his children decided to take advantage of the opportunity and not let such a luxurious house stay empty. So, they threw a party in their usual style. Daniela had to work hard to restore the mansion to its original state. "If you tell Dad anything, I'll destroy you," Gabriella smiled. "I won't say anything," Daniela muttered. "I'm just here to clean, not talk." "Good maid," Gerald remarked approvingly. When Daniela returned to her assigned room at the end of the day, she finally breathed a sigh of relief. They had stopped looking at her with disdain and calling her a servant. Such a polite, nice person, she thought of their father. And such arrogant children. To unwind a little, Daniela decided to take a walk. The Davidson house was located in an upscale neighborhood, so everything around was well kept, and walking there was a pleasure. As she walked, she couldn't imagine that she was being watched. Small, inconspicuous cameras were installed on both her car and the businessman's house, allowing a young police officer, who was very dedicated to his work, to keep a close eye on the suspect. Daniela was still the only one under investigation in the case of the stolen necklace, despite the fact that it had already been returned to its rightful owner. The same cameras also monitored Dolores. Officer Joseph had become very focused on this family. His gut feeling told him that the answer to the mystery lay in one of these people. The question was, in which one? The officer was waiting for David to return so he could start observing him as well. It seemed strange to him that Crossman had gone on a business trip just at the right time. A few days later, Daniela began to get used to her new job. It wasn't that difficult, and she was able to handle the absence of children. Sometimes there were days when she didn't see any of the Davidson family members at all. Those were her favorite days. "Gerald, I'm telling you, we need to hurry up," Gabriella said aggressively as she and her brother had breakfast. "I'm done with all of this. I want money, I want freedom." "Calm down," the young man snapped. "If we get caught, it will be even worse, and then we won't see any inheritance. Look, either we figure something out right now, or I'll handle it on my own," his sister threatened. As Daniela entered the kitchen, they immediately fell silent. "What are you doing here?" Gabriella scowled. "Can't you see we're having breakfast? Go clean somewhere else." Daniela had no choice but to swallow her offense and leave. At her previous job, she had never been insulted, never made to feel humiliated, but with Gabriella, she endured this every day. Her brother wasn't any better, though he rarely made comments about the maid. Mostly, Gerald just ignored her. Still, Daniela noticed the odd behavior of the siblings. Lately, they often whispered to each other, and Gabriella was constantly in a bad mood. She had always had a tough personality, but in the past couple of days, she had become unbearable. "Don't come into the living room all evening," Gabriella ordered. "Do the cleaning in the garden." It wasn't hard to guess that the Davidson children were hiding something, but the maid wasn't keen on finding out. On the contrary, she wanted to stay as far away from this family as possible. When Gabriella finally allowed her to clean the living room, Daniela accidentally found a torn piece of a note. She was about to call Gabriella, but was drawn to what was written. The paper contained a recipe for a herbal remedy and some of the herbs Daniela recognized. For example, she remembered that aconite contained poison. "No, this can't be right," she thought to herself, refusing to believe that the children could be planning to poison their own father. "What are you standing there for?" Gabriella snapped, making Daniela quickly stuff the recipe into her pocket. "Sorry," she muttered, and began cleaning. Later that night, Daniela searched the internet for similar recipes and checked the ingredients listed in the note. There was no longer any doubt. Gabriella and Gerald really did want to poison their father. If the ingredients were mixed together, the elderly man's heart would fail, and he would die almost immediately. Frank Davidson was a true workaholic, even in his older years. He would wake up early and come home late. Most of his time was spent in the office. It was no wonder that with such a work ethic, he had achieved great success. He treated Daniela well. Unlike his children, he was always polite and kind to her. She cherished those rare moments when they managed to talk. In recent days, Daniela felt restless. She knew she couldn't stay silent about this, but she was terrified of getting involved in family matters, especially with how Gabriella had been treating her. At the same time, it was hard for her to look Frank in the eye, especially since he had helped her so much with her job. "Daniela, would you like to have tea with me?" Frank asked one day. She was surprised to find him at home in the middle of the day. Usually, he was already at work by this time. "I'd be happy to," Daniela smiled. "How are you finding working for me?" Taking a sip of her hot drink, Daniela thought for a moment. She couldn't say that being a maid was her dream job, but it was definitely better than sitting at home and suffering. "I like it here," she simply answered. The elderly man smirked, not quite believing her words. "Do my children bother you?" Davidson asked. Daniela sighed, recalling how just a couple of hours earlier, Gabriella had caused a scene that left her with a bad taste in her mouth. "No, everything's fine," Daniela continued to lie. She wasn't the type to complain. "You're trying to be polite," her employer immediately understood, "but believe me, I know how difficult it can be with them, especially Gabriella." "They're nothing like you," Daniela blurted out, and Frank nodded in agreement. "Not surprising," he said, "Gabriella and Gerald aren't actually my biological children. Their parents were once close business partners of mine, so when they died in a car accident, I decided to take guardianship of the twins. They were 5 years old at the time." The confession stunned Daniela. She nearly choked on her tea. Adopted children were unlikely to have a deep attachment to the businessman, so they could easily send him to his grave for the inheritance. Now, she realized with clarity that remaining silent could be too dangerous. She had kept this secret for several days already. And then, gathering her courage, Daniela revealed everything, the strange behavior of his children and the recipe she had recently found. "Thank you, Daniela," he said seriously. "I'll be careful." Daniela hoped that, now that he was warned, he would be prepared. After all, she had done everything she could in this situation, and she felt a little more at ease. "Is the necklace back home?" Gabriella asked the next morning, catching sight of it in her father's office. "Looks like it," her brother responded indifferently, not caring about the trinket. This only made Gabriella angrier. She shouted at the cook, claiming the breakfast was awful, then flipped the plates onto the floor and ordered Daniela to clean it up. "Every morning in our household starts the same way," Gerald chuckled, watching his sister storm off. It was then that Daniela had the thought that Gabriella might be behind the disappearance of the necklace. She didn't even need to be sneaky to get it, as she had access to all the rooms in the house, and her father kept the necklace in an open place. Gabriella seemed like the type of person who could pull off such a deed. Daniela decided she would talk to her employer about it. What if his daughter decided to steal the necklace again? The maid planned to speak with Mr. Davidson that evening. However, she then heard the news that the businessman had been rushed to the hospital after suffering a heart attack. He had suddenly felt ill at work, and the employees had quickly called an ambulance. Could they have poisoned him? He promised to be careful, Daniela thought in a panic. The Davidson children were not frightened by the news at all. They exchanged meaningful glances and then began preparing to go to the hospital. Even Daniela, who was practically a stranger to Frank, was more concerned than they were. "Can I go to the clinic too?" Daniela asked anxiously. "Heh, the maid." Gabriella sneered. "You know what? I think I'll fire you. I'm tired of your annoying face. You have no right." Daniela tried to stand up for herself for the first time. "Your father hired me. Only he can make that decision." "What, you lost all fear?" Gerald interjected. "You're nobody in this house. Now our word is law." Daniela took a deep breath. "You won't fire me," she repeated, trying not to lose her composure. "I know everything." Gabriella's eyes glinted dangerously. She took a few steps toward Daniela. "What are you talking about?" Gabriella said, her tone dripping with threat. "About you." Daniela couldn't hold back any longer, hinting at the poisoning attempt and the stolen necklace. "You only try to harm your father." No one suspected that what was happening in the Davidson mansion was being broadcast live at the police station. Joseph was closely monitoring the situation. "Marcus, call a team to the businessman's address," he ordered. "I have a bad feeling about this." When Gabriella realized that the maid knew everything, a wave of rage overtook her. She swung and slapped Daniela so hard that she lost her balance and fell to her knees. "You little rat! Snooping around here!" Gabriella shouted. "I knew something was off with you." Gabriella began kicking her, bending Daniela over in pain. "Gabriella, stop!" Her brother tried to pull her away. "We need to think about what to do next." "What's there to think about?" Gabriella was livid. "If she talks, we're done for. We need to deal with this now." "Not like this," Gerald smirked. "She'll end up with too many bruises. Better ask if there's still some of that brew left." At these words, Daniela's body broke out in chills. This was the very poison that was now causing their father to suffer. She tried to move back, but Gerald grabbed her by the hair, holding her in place. "You're a genius." Gabriella smiled, then ran off to fetch the deadly concoction. She wanted to pour it directly into the maid's mouth while her brother held her still. Daniela resisted as much as she could, but when she was struck again, she felt herself losing consciousness. Gabriella had already tilted the bottle over her mouth when the police burst into the house. "Everyone freeze," Joseph announced loudly. Everything happened so quickly that the poisoner's hand trembled, spilling the concoction on the floor. Gerald tried to flee, but was immediately caught by a police officer and pinned to the ground. "It hurts," Gerald roared. With great effort, Daniela managed to get to her feet. Joseph rushed to her side, offering her a glass of water. "How are you?" he asked. She was unsteady from the blows. Her whole body ached, and her head spun. It felt as though she might vomit at any moment. "Honestly, not great," Daniela said, clutching her head. "But if you had come a few minutes later, it would have been worse." Joseph had to steady her so that she wouldn't lose her balance and fall again. "Yes, I understand. You're feeling bad," he said sympathetically. "However, now we all have to go to the station. That's the rule." Daniela nodded. The station wasn't an unfamiliar place to her anymore. At least she was being taken there as a witness, not as a suspect. When they arrived, Gabriella and Gerald offered little resistance. At first, they tried to justify themselves, but when shown the solid evidence in the form of a recording, they confessed to everything. It was an incredibly long day. By the time Daniela left the station, she was exhausted. They had provided her with medical assistance, treated her wounds, and applied bandages to her bruises. Looking at her reflection in the mirror now, Daniela shuddered, imagining how swollen her face would be the next day. "Can I give you a ride home?" Joseph offered. "You've clearly been through a lot." "Yeah," Daniela smiled faintly, agreeing to his offer. "But it's still not over, is it?" Unfortunately, the police officer admitted. The Davidsons aren't the only pieces in this puzzle, so the investigation continues. When they said their goodbyes, Daniela asked Joseph to keep her updated on the situation. As soon as she opened the door, her husband appeared. It was so sudden that she stepped back in shock. "Good God, you scared me!" Daniela gasped as she entered. "Don't you have anything to tell me?" David began the conversation with a note of discontent. "What the hell? I'm the last to find out you're working as a maid for some guy." This accusation stunned her. "Are you serious?" Daniela said, now starting to boil with anger. "You suddenly leave for your business trip, don't answer your phone for several days, and then you want something from me? I tried to warn you, but physically couldn't." "If you really wanted to, you could have come up with something," he stubbornly said. "In any case, you're not working there anymore. I don't want my wife living in someone else's house." He didn't even mention the bruises on her face. He didn't ask how she was doing or why she made such a drastic decision to change jobs that she loved so much. Nothing. Just complaints. "You know what?" Daniela said coldly. "I'll decide for myself where I work. You can want whatever you want, but the final word will always be mine." David couldn't respond. He was too shocked by the change in his once meek and obedient wife. Joseph was actively investigating, which soon led him to the fateful pawn shop. The whole department got involved in the case, as the police had long wanted to shut down this den of crime, and now there was a perfect opportunity. Since Gabriella had given them all the names, the police knew which strings to pull. Gradually, Joseph was able to get to Evelina, the manager, and her lover, David Crossman. Now it became clear to him how Daniela had gotten involved in this story. "You are acquitted on all counts," Joseph announced shortly after. She was so relieved that, unable to contain herself, Daniela hugged him. "Thank you," Daniela said sincerely. "I had already lost hope for a fair trial." "Never lose it," along with faith and love, the policeman smiled back at her. After she was fully acquitted, she visited the elderly businessman in the hospital. Fortunately, the surgery had been successful, and his life was no longer in danger. He was on the road to recovery. They had a long conversation, during which Daniela told him everything that had happened. "Gabriella and my late wife never got along," Frank finally said. "My wife always told me that trouble would come from that girl. And she was right. I wish I had listened to her 20 years ago." "Well, what's done is done," Daniela shrugged. Just as she was about to leave, Frank asked her to stay. "I wanted to say something else," he said, just as an unfamiliar man entered the room, greeting the patient warmly and then nodding at Daniela. "This is Mark. A good friend of mine and a lawyer," Mr. Davidson explained. "Daniela, I want to make you my heir." Daniela immediately sat down in shock. This news was overwhelming. "I'm practically a stranger to you," she said, flustered. "No, I can't accept that." "Well, you're not really a stranger," the businessman disagreed. "You've taken better care of me than my own family. I won't forget that." "You can continue to refuse, but that won't change my decision," Frank smiled. "The person is already here," he pointed to the notary. "In a couple of minutes, we'll write a new will." "What am I going to do with you?" Daniela could only say, still stunned. "But the most important thing is, please, get better." When Daniela left the hospital, her husband caught up with her. After Joseph had dug up the full story behind the pawn shop, David and Evelina's affair was no longer a secret. The manager was about to face court for her numerous fraudulent schemes, and her lover, fortunately for him, only faced a long conversation at the police station. Daniela was determined to divorce him. She didn't want to remain married to a cheater who had also put her in such a position with the necklace. "Daniela, please, wait," David pleaded. "Let's talk, okay? We've already talked, many times. How much more do I have to say that I don't want to live with you for you to understand? Daniela, please, try to forgive me," he continued. "We've been together for so many years. Isn't it unreasonable to break up a marriage over one mistake?" She was starting to get angry. He was calling this disgusting betrayal just one mistake? "David, I'm disgusted being near you," she hissed through her teeth. "Just disappear from my life, that's all." Daniela turned to walk away, but her husband grabbed her by the elbow and pulled her toward him. She began to struggle. At that moment, a police car pulled up to the hospital. It was Joseph, who had come to take Davidson's statement. "Let the woman go," the policeman said coldly, stepping closer. David immediately released her and stepped back, raising his hands. The recent interrogation was still fresh in his mind. "Chief, I didn't do anything wrong," David started to assure him. "It's all okay, I've let go." Daniela quickly stepped behind Joseph, feeling safe beside him. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, glancing her over. She nodded. "Aha, so that's what's going on." David narrowed his eyes. "I get it now. You're having an affair behind my back, aren't you? Now I see why you're so eager to divorce me. What a bitch you are, Daniela." "Watch your words," the policeman growled. "Or I'll arrange for you to spend 15 days in the drunk tank." David silently pressed his lips together and walked away. It was too dangerous to argue with an officer while on duty. "Sorry for that outburst," Daniela sighed. "We're in the process of getting divorced, so he's losing his mind. I understand. But if you ever need help, make sure to let me know." "I'll be there," Joseph said, offering a reassuring smile. Daniela just smiled back. During the investigation, they had become very close. After that, she decided to visit the kindergarten. After all, working with children was her calling. Daniela really wanted to return. She had all the proof of her innocence, so she needed to regain her good name. Since businessman Mr. Davidson was a well-known figure and his necklace had received widespread attention, the news about the case spread quickly. By the time Daniela stepped into the kindergarten, everyone already knew she had been framed. "I deeply apologize," the director said. "It seems I rushed to conclusions. If you still want to work here after everything that happened, I'd be happy to have you back." Daniela gratefully accepted the apology and returned to her children. Her pupils were incredibly happy to see their favorite teacher back. The kids eagerly surrounded her with hugs, almost knocking her off balance, but she was just as thrilled to be back with them. At the end of the day, she ran into Joseph again. "Come on," she smiled. "So, you were taking statements from Davidson at lunch. What about now?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Now, I'm picking up my son from kindergarten," Joseph grinned. Daniela raised an eyebrow in surprise, and just then, a blond boy ran up to Joseph and threw his arms around him. "Well, I'll be," Daniela exclaimed, looking at the father and son, who were so alike. The boy's name was Robert, and he was in a younger group that was led by another teacher. The policeman explained that he had sometimes seen Daniela when picking up his son. Now, it made sense to her why he had decided to take on her case. "I knew right away that you weren't guilty," Joseph explained. "So, I started my own investigation." "Yeah, and you were quite successful at it," Daniela smiled. Later that evening, they went to a cafe with his son. Joseph shared that he was raising Robert on his own. His wife had died in a car accident when the child was 6 months old. Daniela's eyes widened when she heard about how Joseph had managed to cope alone with a 6-month-old baby. "You're a real hero," she marveled. "Not everyone could do that." "There was no choice," Joseph said with a hint of sadness in his voice. Daniela understood. They had touched a wound that he would never fully heal from. To offer him a bit of support, she gently touched his palm and squeezed it. In response, Joseph intertwined their fingers. Daniela smiled, feeling a warm sensation spreading inside her. A couple of days later, her divorce from David was finalized. As she walked out of the courthouse, she took a deep breath. It felt as though she was letting go of all her problems and torment along with that marriage. Daniela felt like her life was finally coming together. Her relationship with Joseph blossomed quickly afterward. When they started dating, Daniela moved in with him. She was worried about how Robert would react since he had only seen her at the kindergarten before, but the boy quickly warmed up to his father's girlfriend and grew to love her. He was proud that his beloved teacher was now his mom. And when Daniela's birthday came around, Joseph proposed to her. "Yes," Daniela said, wiping away tears. A year later, on her next birthday, they had a daughter.